Before we get to Jamal Mashburn, there's a few things I want to do here on the Open. I have some minor NBA stuff, although Cat's injury is not minor. That's devastating news, depending on the length of what's going on with his knee injury. Although earlier this morning, at first it felt like he was out, and then it was like, hey, they're going to reevaluate, and maybe he can play with this meniscus injury. But we'll see. So I have some thoughts on that. Not a Tales from the Couch. I wouldn't do that to you twice in a week, but just a couple thoughts on some of the games last night. But I want to start with the quarterbacks in free agency. We'll go through and rank them because we love to rank stuff. And I've got 5 guys for you. The number 1 guy is still Kirk Cousins. He'll be 36 in August. The Achilles injury happened on 10/29. So I don't know if just less than a year window is enough for him to feel like he's going to be all the way back. He's definitely somebody that's been sacked quite a bit. So you worry about it. And you wonder, even back to like 22, that season, he was sacked the 3rd highest total of any quarterback in the league. I've personally had a long history in talking about Kirk Cousins. Well, he's been around for a long time. I think I joked at one point, if Daniel Jeremiah's podcast was called Move the Sticks, Kirk Cousins would have a podcast called Short of the Sticks. He's always had big stats, but I've always felt like the stats are a little bit bigger than his game. I mean, he completed 70% of his passes here in 23. But he's only won 1 playoff game in his entire career, and he was really good in that game. But I liked him this past season, and I don't know if something changed. It likely changed for me, and more so than he was just a different QB. Although, look, I thought there were certain games this year where I was just more impressed with him in certain weeks this season than in other weeks. But it's also fair to suggest that maybe I just accepted who Kirk Cousins is, because Kirk is someone for a team that's drafted a couple players or signed somebody else. Maybe they've had 3 or 4 quarterbacks and it hasn't worked out. And they're looking at him going, okay, look, we know he's not perfect. We know there's still some limitations. We know the numbers are probably a little bit better. And maybe teams would disagree with me, but I feel like the numbers, when you look at the baseball card, right? The idea of that, you're like, man, this guy had a hell of a career. In I would say, like, in basketball, he probably ends up being a Hall of Famer. Okay. In the NFL, you usually have to have way more playoff success, but you can have just a ton of playoff success and maybe not even be good as statistically as Cousins is in the regular season and still make the Hall of Fame. But he provides just a stability. Now, I remember years ago, we did the Quarterbacks as Girlfriends podcast. I think it was in 2018. The only reason I remember that, whether it was 18 or 19, was because there was a writer that was really upset with us for doing it, being like, seriously, guys, it's 2018 and we're still doing this. I'm like, what? What rule was passed on that one? But if we allow it just one more time with Kirk, it's like your buddy who just, like, man, you might have to start looking at different options for companionship, like, maybe stay out of the entertainment industry. Maybe stay out of the late night entertainment industry. I think your girlfriend hates you. Are you constantly worried about where you're at? Where Cousins is, yeah, I've known her since junior high. She lives down the street. Family gets along. Parents have always been friends. I know what I'm getting, and she knows what she's getting. And there's just like, yeah, maybe I could do better, but I want to stop worrying about it all the time. And that's what I think Kirk Cousins is. The other part of it is, early on, I don't love some of the stuff from back when he was in Washington and my guy Colt McCoy was there. I think at that stage of his career, if you're a younger quarterback, you really should be looking out for yourself. But I don't know that it was always the greatest there. But at 36, if he's coming in, and if there is a younger quarterback, he might just be looking at this as like, look, maybe it's a 2-year deal anyway. I'd be surprised if Minnesota just turned the page from him, knowing that they don't really have a solution on the roster and they're not in a position draft-wise to get one of the top guys. So I still think Kirk is number 1 in this class. Number 2 is Baker. He'll be 29 in April. He had the lowest QBR of any qualifying quarterback in the 2022 season. He played with Carolina, 7 games with them, 5 games with LA, and then, ends up on Tampa. And there will be demand for him if he makes it a free agency, if he doesn't work out a deal with Tampa, even though the reports were that they were slowly, quote, slowly working on a new deal. So they've got less than a week to figure this out. But it feels like evaluators still like him. I don't know if it's better than the Sam Darnold tier, but it's one of those quarterbacks where you feel like the people that did the evaluation for his draft class looked at him and liked him. I mean, granted, yes, he went number one, so this isn't exactly a mystery, but the fact he keeps getting that many chances, there has to be something on film there from him in the NFL that teams can talk themselves into it. He played all 17 games this season. It's his first full season since 2020. In 2020, he was really good. 26-8, touchdown interception split, 10th in QBR. And if you're having that internal debate about Baker being your future quarterback, I remember having Eric Mangini in studio with us back at ESPN, and I love talking. We need to get Mangini back on. I always love talking to him. A total 180, getting to know Mangini in person versus the perception of him when he was a head coach. But he said something that was really simple, but I think just beneficial in understanding the philosophy of these decisions. We were talking about some other quarterback. I think it might even have been Matt Castle. And I was like, what do you do when you're looking at somebody going, all right, we probably could do better. We don't know if we'll have the option to do better. We're going to be competing with other teams for the same guys. We bring in somebody who's never done it. Then there's always the question of, can this person actually do it? So there's actually a lot of value in somebody, especially at this age of 29, despite the injury history with Baker, where if you look at Mangini's philosophy, and I'm sure he's not the only one that feels this way, the simplicity of, at least we know that he's done it. Okay. And he wins a playoff game this year against Philly with Tampa. He has the 2020 season. So I don't know if he's necessarily going to break the bank with all the guaranteed money. There still might be some protections for Tampa because it feels like Tampa still just kind of has to get this done. But it's a little Cousins light in that the other teams would go, all right, our other options are just not very good, whether it's where we're drafting on our own roster, who we'd be able to afford in free agency. At least we know that he's done it at a certain level. And remember, when I went through all the first round quarterbacks who ended up on a second team, there were none of them that won, and it had to be within the window of when I did the study. I think it was like 20 years of first round picks, or maybe it was 10. I don't know. But the point is we had like a decade plus gap of quarterbacks that were first round picks that had not won a playoff game with their second team. And we had Baker do it this year, and Goff, who didn't just do it, almost got to a Super Bowl and is now the face of a franchise in a way that I didn't think he was capable of. So two guys getting it done in ways we had not seen in recent history. Number three, I'm actually going with Justin Fields over Russell Wilson. All right, he turned 25 this week. Happy birthday. He was still 23rd in QBR this season. I am always a little surprised at how much it feels like social media loves Fields. In 2022, I got it because he was running all over the place and the runs were absolutely incredible. I mean, his numbers rushing the football, 160 carries, 1,100 plus yards, 7.1 yards per carry. This year, the yards per carry, the overall yards, they both dipped down. We know he got hurt. But he did cut down on the interception rate, which was a nice little jump for him. He got beat up again. I mean, there's not a lot of offensive talent. Moore was pretty good for him, but we get the point that it's not an ideal situation for developing a quarterback. But even though I'm surprised that they're just, maybe it's just what I'm seeing, but I am seeing enough of it to be surprised by it, that there feels like there's still a lot of support for Fields, that he deserves the fourth year with Chicago. I can't imagine ever passing on Caleb Williams for him to do the fourth year. I don't worry about any of the contract stuff because, okay, fine, the fourth year option is cheap. And then the fifth year thing that you have to make a decision on later this year, yeah, it jumps up, but it's 1 year of guaranteed money when the salary cap went up almost $50 million in 2 years. So it's not really that big of a deal. And I'd rather have him prove it in 24 and then have to pay him. And then if he gets to free agency and I'm worried, like that's actually a good thing because he played well enough that we have to worry about paying him money down the road. So I don't really look at it as a negative at all. But I'd like to have seen a bigger jump because it's been 3 years of, I think early on, some of the interceptions, the first 2 years, I'm like, is he seeing it? That pick that I talk about when you're throwing it to one side and the safety just staring at you, waiting to make that throw. And you're like, are you not seeing that safety there? I mean, it's one thing when the ball is tipped. It's one thing when it's late in the game and you're forcing the issue because of game score and time that's left. But some of the picks were just really, really alarming. So I think he got better at that. The numbers bear that out. But for 3 years in, to have faith for him to be the next starter for a team, I'd just like to see a little bit more. I'm not saying he needs to be Josh Allen or he would be Josh Allen, but Josh Allen's significant jump after those first 2 years of like, is this guy going to be the guy? It was a massive jump in that third year. And now he's one of the best quarterbacks in the league. I don't know that we see the third to fourth year jump all that often. I need to dig back into that. But here's another positive for Fields. his teammates seem to have his back publicly. All right. Whenever I'm thinking about a player or a coach or something, we're like, hey, do you ever notice that there's never really anything positive coming from teammates other than the after the game locker room standard cliches that we hear all the time? His teammates, there's a group of teammates for Fields of the Bears that seem adamant about wanting him to stick around. That is a perfect transition as I talk about the personality of Justin Fields to my number 4 quarterback, and that's Russell Wilson. Stop saying he was better last year than he was in 22. You're right. He was. Um, there's a lot of people that are better after they're terrible. And that's what he was in 22. It was the 5th lowest QBR in the NFL. Anyone else with his numbers in 22 would have been benched or would have been a rookie. Get Up actually had a segment, I think, once when Denver started winning games this year where it was like, hey, do we need to apologize to Russell Wilson? The answer is no. Denver won games because of their defense and the turnover margin that they had for like a month straight, and because Patrick Mahomes was sick. He plays a position scared. The one good number that I could find when I dug through all of it, and look, for quarterbacks, you can kind of find, usually find a couple good numbers. You can find some bad ones. I mean, there's even one number where I look at the aggressiveness of throws. Mahomes was the least aggressive by next gen stats of any quarterback in the NFL this year. Usually that's not a great sign, but Mahomes is just not the guy that fits any single mold. So there was a number for Wilson on pickable passes where only 2.65% of his passes were considered pickable passes. Bailey Zappi was number 1. Joe Flacco was number 2. I think Mac Jones was 4. So New England had the rare feat of having 2 quarterbacks in the top 5 of the same stat. But just because he wasn't throwing a lot of pickable passes is actually telling more of a story because his average air yards was 7.5, which isn't good. His QBR was still 21st. And so when you watched, he just didn't want to raise the level of risk. And I don't know if that was protecting his stat line. I don't know if it wasn't seeing things. I don't know if it wasn't being comfortable in Peyton's offense. But I think that's why you saw constant frustration with him, where it was like, hey, there's just throws out there that you need to start making. And I think physically he's fairly diminished from where he was in Seattle. I mean, he's taken a million hits over his career. I think some of it you can blame the offensive line, but sometimes it was just really hard to block for Wilson because he'd keep plays alive and you wouldn't even know where he was behind you and then therefore which blocking angles to take. So I was also surprised to see the amount of sympathy for him once he was benched, because maybe it was just a management employee thing. I don't know. But it was the rare case, like all of a sudden everybody seemed to be sympathetic towards Russell Wilson's side of it. But the bigger issue about Wilson as a free agent signing is like, I don't even know if it's which quarterback are you getting. It's which version of him are you getting? Because the only version that we've seen has been one of the most calculated, I would say, disingenuous public speakers we have in pro sports. And that's maybe a nice way of saying it just feels fraudulent all the time. The only time he's ever given us any depth, like any real depth in an answer, when he was explaining the timeline of being threatened to be potentially benched if he didn't want to move around some of the dates of a clause with his contract. And really what he was doing was making sure that his version of events got out there to then get that sympathy, which he actually received. You can go back and look at the timeline of all the benching stuff and all the news and notes of that. Like, look, I guess Denver could be nicer. Peyton could be nicer to Russell Wilson, but ultimately they'd given him this extension, which, by the way, an extension that he'll never technically play a snap for with Denver once the extension is kicked in this year. But people lost their minds on this story. He wasn't good. He hasn't been good. It's a massive disappointment. It's going to go down as one of the worst trades in NFL history. And they were like, well, it's been so bad and we don't see it getting any better. Imagine when Peyton's watching the film, what he's seeing, for them to come to this conclusion that they're going to eat this much money. Okay. So Denver was supposed to be nicer about it when we all realize players and then the teams constantly remind us that we don't need to be reminded that it's a business over and over and over again. So I don't care about the nice part of it. I thought it was just very interesting that it was like, wait, we're actually getting a real answer from Russell Wilson here. Oh, why are we getting it? It's because he wants to make sure that his story is being told, as opposed to it's just, hey, Russell Wilson's being benched. So the reason I bring up all of this stuff, and again, this isn't news. I mean, the interviews over the years are absolutely brutal to listen to. Is if you're the next team, like, am I getting that guy? Where all of it is about his brand and his image and this portrayal of this like superhero figure. because that stuff is all right when you're winning and you're the face of the franchise and you're playing in a couple Super Bowls in Seattle. That stuff is really, really grating when you're not that good of a position anymore and you're losing games every single week, as we saw multiple times at Denver. So if I'm the next team and thinking, okay, there still has to be something there. I've actually always really liked him, the quarterback, except for the last 2 years. But are you coming in humbled, or are you coming in with the same bullshit? Because he's going to be really cheap because of the offset language in his contract. Whatever dollar he gets paid now is a dollar Denver doesn't have to pay him. So, I mean, honestly, he might be motivated to sign for even less to make sure Denver still has to pay the entire thing. But you get the point. This is not going to cost a lot of money. At a chance at somebody one year, I argue for the MVP. But I don't know if I'd get an honest answer with him, with his people about, like, are you coming in here with a slightly different mindset and some alteration to your personality that seems to drive people fucking crazy? Because if you still think that you're going to get away with that stuff somewhere new now after what you've done in Denver the last 2 years, then I'm good. I'd still take him over Mac Jones. Number 5, Ryan Tannehill, 36 in July. Kind of ran out of guys here. His stats for 2 years, I remember looking at those at Tennessee and be like, wait, these stats are incredible. Don't know that I really believed it. But it's been 2 years. He's been beat up a lot. And again, better than Mac Jones. Tannehill, number 5.